Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jessica and I are really looking forward to getting a chance to reflect on this year plus long campaign that we have worked on around just infrastructure for water, the environment, communities, and are looking forward to reporting out what we've learned, what we did, what we learned, and hearing from you all if there are things from the campaign, if you're familiar with it, things you use that were helpful, feedback. If you're new to it, we'll definitely be going through all the elements and spending a little bit of the time at the end talking through how we think we can apply what we learned to the political moment going forward. And then we should have a pretty robust amount of time for kind of discussion questions at the end. So for anyone who doesn't know us, I'll introduce the Water Hub and then we'll introduce ourselves and I'll hand it over to Jessica to launch us into today's presentation. So the Water Hub is a pro bono communications organization. We're a nonprofit, grant funded, and we work all across the United States to help work to advance clean water access and affordability, climate-related risks and opportunities for water, and also working to shift our relationship with water. We do that through providing hands-on communications help, particularly for community-based organizations and groups that have traditionally lacked in having communications capacity. We also do that through field-wide resources, things like our annual voter poll. We have a lot of communications resources on our website, as well as these kind of lift all boats type campaigns like Just Infrastructure. And for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Sarah Bucci. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Colorado. I'm the Director of Strategic Communications with the Water Hub, and I've been on our team since September 2020. And I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Hey everyone, so excited to be with you today. My name is Jessica Jewell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based outside of Los Angeles on Tongva land, and I'm the digital director at the Water Hub. And I've been here since March of 2021 and looking forward to go through all of these pieces with you and share what we learned and what we want to pass along. Great. So first, from the top, I just wanted to share it. So this campaign was made possible by the Water Solutions Fund. And this campaign was intended to build awareness around the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law for their historic investments in water. It was designed to build support and visibility for more nature-based solutions, community-based projects, and vital water system work, like accelerating lead pipe replacement, all through a lens of justice. This gave us a creative challenge to communicate the need for equitable policy implementation for communities and the wild spaces that need it most, and to build awareness around the positives before a possible clawback. Well, now we're here in this Republican trifecta, and in an anti-government environment, it can be challenging to keep public awareness going for federal funding. But these benefits can still be framed through different populist values that we'll go into later. So the learnings are still applicable today. We were also hoping to get some media attention for solution stories taking root on the ground, because too often we saw coverage focus on the money, but not as much on the positive impacts coming to communities and through concrete stories, for lack of a better term. So next slide. So before we built our campaign, we did some deep listening to identify the needs of organizations across the country. We did interviews with a couple dozen groups to learn what they wanted and needed during this policy moment. It was a challenge to thread the needle of what we wanted to highlight and how to package the campaign, as the laws, as we all know, are quite sprawling in their reach and complexity. So it was a big help to get more focused and to make sure that we were also serving the needs of the field. We also, for the first time, created a fellowship to hire an artist or an organizer to help shape the campaign from the ground up. We ended up choosing not one, but three, and ended up delegating different tasks to each of them to play to their strengths across brand identity, artwork, messaging, and video production. They were hugely helpful, and they also challenged us throughout the process to get clear on different pieces, including what we're going to name the campaign, who the website audience really was, and getting really clear in our message. We were really lucky to work with digital strategist Dylan St. Bernard, based out of LA, academic and media producer Sharon Roberts, based out of New Orleans, and artist Dio Kramer, based out of Minneapolis, who worked on the Stop Line 3 campaign. And something we'll go into a little more later also was the unintentional success that we had of staging the campaign's content throughout the life cycle of it. And this gave us more opportunity and legs to get more refreshed creative and points of engagement. So next, I will pass it off to Sarah.
So before we get into our learnings, we just wanted to make sure to share out all the different components of the campaign. If you use any of these materials through your own work, we would love to hear that in the chat. And for anyone who's not familiar, we'll do a little bit of show and tell. So the first thing is that justinfrastructure.org, the website, is really the hub for the campaign. Everything can be found on that page, from downloadable art that Jessica is going to go through in a minute to the video content, fact sheets, all that stuff. The goal of our campaign was to make the story of federal water investments about more than just money. Through our conversations with partners, our own research, we decided to kind of narrow down and organize the campaign around three pillars that encapsulated three main problems or issue areas that investing in our water infrastructure was addressing. So we, on the homepage, definitely still note the sheer amount of funding that's available to different projects. But what we really wanted to do was kind of stitch together a cohesive story about the impact that investing in water and in our communities has, instead of 1,000 different stories about a bunch of different pots of money from different government agencies. And so we did that by organizing things around weather whiplash, which is really what we were focused on, drought resilience in the West, and the major fluctuations that a lot of communities are facing between issues of drought and flooding. The second was around the human right to water and sanitation. This content pillar was really focused on issues around access to safe drinking water, things like toxics in our water, like PFAS, removing lead pipes, that kind of like in your home kind of pipes and concrete type projects. And then the third was around flood justice. And the feedback that we got from partners when we were doing this listening was that what they really needed to communicate with two different audiences. They wanted to raise awareness within their local communities, tell the story about what these kind of projects, how these kind of projects could benefit, what kinds of projects wanted to be prioritized, and the need to do that prioritization for disadvantaged communities. And then the second audience was advocating to decision makers to really help get those resources to their communities. So we try to address both of those through the materials.
So, as far as artwork, what we did was we created 3 different pieces of artwork for each theme. And we took quite a bit of time to explore how we wanted to design this with intention. So the creative briefing process was, thoughtful and slow and steady so that we could make sure to be really simple with this artwork, but still representational. So what we did was we wanted to make sure we could include people as much as possible into these pieces to connect infrastructure, which is a wonky and abstract concept to some, to make sure that people can connect to place and heart. And we also tried to make these pieces semi-localized, as you see here on the left, with one of the flood justice pieces of artwork advocating for green streets. This looks like it could be in the South or New Orleans. And so that's just one example of how we try to localize the artwork. So on the next slide, you'll see a couple more examples of some of the other pieces. So each of the themes had its own color to tie the artwork together and create some visual continuity. And, our fellows really, like I said, were hugely instrumental in challenging us to keep it simple and really clear in both the artwork and the language. So that was excellent feedback throughout the process and it really showed in the artwork and how it performed later. And I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Jessica. So as I mentioned, we organized the materials in the campaign around 3 content pillars. And then under each of those pillars had a number of resources that were available for advocates, community members, and other organizations, as well as the news media, which I'll get to. We also had a kind of resource hub on the page in which everything was available for download. And I mentioned that we had kind of sort of this bank shot of working with advocates and wanting to reach 2 different audiences. So we had resources that were really meant to be more internal facing. So for each of the issue areas, we created message guidance, which included things like background information, values-led messaging blocks, kind of general guidance, advice, talking points, which included examples of funding and action. And these were really meant to be internal resources to support advocates and community organizers in their work. In addition to the kind of 3 pillars, we also created a 4th guide around nature-based solutions, which was actually I believe, the most popular resource that we created. So I'm glad that was something folks found helpful. And then we also created resources that were meant to be external facing. So that included the artwork and digital components, which Jessica's going to get back into in a minute, as well as fact sheets, which were downloadable for use as well. So each of these fact sheets included, so these are meant to be able to be downloaded, printed off, used in your work to tell the story of this funding and action, the benefits it was bringing to communities, with a bunch of real world examples and case studies. And then the other place we created was a resource hub for journalists who had been covering infrastructure issues. In addition to kind of a lot of proactive pitching that we did, this was meant to be like a resource hub. So we had linked out to a bunch of partner resources. We tried to encapsulate news stories that we saw covering the issues in this media center, as well as having story starters, just ideas for deeper reporting that could be done around infrastructure beyond just that funding, those funding announcements we saw a lot of. And for each of the pillars, we also included potential sources, spokespeople, and other organizations that journalists could reach out to.
Awesome. So as I said earlier, we ended up staging the phases of our content rollout on digital. What we did for the launch was release 10 illustrations and the website with a strategy for how we paced them out. We started with a piece of artwork, then we shared a case study image of a funded project on the ground, and then we would do an explainer carousel to encapsulate each theme of what's included and the benefits that are coming to communities. Then the second stage in the spring was when we released an animated video created by Silkworm Studios that Sarah will share, and a series of interviews from advocates on the ground centered on each thematic pillar. And then last, we partnered with a group of influencers to do some storytelling around how these laws support the human right to clean water and sanitation. We didn't necessarily plan it this way with the different content cycles, but it ended up working very well. We had originally hoped to launch the video with the campaign's rollout, but it worked out to have more creative content mid-cycle. And we would definitely recommend approaching your campaign storytelling this way if you have a bunch of assets or materials to keep interest sustained. It gives more legs and more points of engagement for folks. Another tool that we ended up testing for the first time was something called SoSha. It's an interactive social media toolkit that can be filterable, and it can also provide data analytics. So, you know, many of us use Google Docs, but unlike the Google Doc conundrum of not knowing how many people looked at it, this gave us some data insight of how many visits it got. So we also tested new technology as part of this campaign. And next to you, Sarah.
Great. The next thing I want to do is actually play the animated video that we created. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but I cannot watch it enough because I think it does a really good job of sharing this vision of what the world we want to build with through investing in water and in our communities is. Just want to give a shout out to our teammate, Jose Aranda, who was the real visionary and producer behind this, working really closely with Silkworm Studio to integrate the art created by Dio Kramer with a mixed media approach. We were able to work with some amazing musicians, Benny Starr and Roderick, to create the soundscape for this. So it was a really collaborative effort, and we're able to feature the voices of partners we had interviewed over the prior year from Verde in Portland, Earth Justice, the Prevention Institute, and the Water Collaborative of Greater New Orleans. So something we're definitely really proud of, and we'll take a minute to watch.
Resilient infrastructure looks like community benefits. It looks like communities envisioning projects from the beginning and planning for the next 7 generations, if not more.
What would it look like to have water infrastructure centered on justice?
Well, to answer that question, I'm gonna go back in time first, because once upon a time in the 70s, our water was filled with sewage and our rivers were on fire. Congress and our country decided to pass the Clean Water Act and to provide lots of money to fix our water infrastructure. Unfortunately, all of that investment wasn't really distributed equally.
There was an intentional discriminatory, racist kind of history where we were, redline, they call it, into these pockets of like these toxic hotspots.
And so even to this day, you can still see sight of that, where in the blacker neighborhoods or just neighborhoods of color, even the lower income neighborhoods, there's not a lot of green space. It's just concrete. There tends to be more crime, more flooding. Property values are lower.
So our role currently is to turn that around.
Every decade since the 70s, the federal government has invested less and less and less in water infrastructure until really recently.
There's huge investments in infrastructure right now. A lot of it has to do with stormwater capture. We have the capacity to capture that stormwater runoff, put it into the aquifers, slow it down, spread it, sink it into green streets by putting, these beautiful bioswales and like pathways and benches, right? So you're not only beautifying the community, but you're also now playing a role in really thinking about the future.
And so what I would love to see, I think what we would all love to see, is honestly more green space in those areas. to create a safe place for people to play and recreate. And with that comes crime reduction. With that comes a reduction in urban heat island effect. There are so many benefits to that, health and wellness, for people to just be able to be outside.
We want all of them to be able to go to the nearest creek or river, swim in it. We want them to be able to know that the wetlands in their community or outside of their city are helping stop floodwaters when we get storms caused by climate change. If you live in a rural community where your neighbor lives a mile down the road, you still don't have to worry about the color of the water in your faucet or if the rainstorm is going to cause sewage to come back up into your basement or your backyard. Or if you live in a city like Detroit or Chicago and you know all 50 neighbors on your block and you want to make sure that none of you had lead service lines anymore, and you don't have to worry about getting bottled water from somewhere else.
And so it'd be nice for people to just have trees, shade where they can walk around and play and walk their dog and, just live. And that's really what we want to see.
Tell me what you gonna do when the water keeps rising.
It is such a vibe. I love watching that video every time. Thanks for joining us on that journey. So next, I'm going to be chatting through the digital results of the campaign across the website, social media, and the influencer collaborations we did. And this data is reflected from February to July of this year. Overall, next slide. No. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Overall, including the influencer collabs that we'll go into later, there were 250,000 video views, 224 posts, and 28,000 engagements on social. And the top themes on digital that we saw were related to flood justice and the human right to water. We also learned that people resonated more with the illustrations that we shared versus those case study photos we had of those various funded projects I had mentioned. And this told us that the art created an engaging sense for folks to see on their feeds, to tap into that sense of radical imagination of the world that we want to envision together. And as far as tone, messaging that was grounded in hope did well, as did, messaging around nature-based solutions. And then on the flip side, the shocking facts around the gaps with access to clean water and sanitation were also highly engaging. Some other learnings included how important collaboration is online. This might seem like a no-brainer, but when you make an Instagram post collaborative, it'll show up on both organizational feeds and can give cross-pollination opportunities and more opportunities for engagement to reach different folks. And we did this with interviews that we released later in the campaign and also with our creator collaborations. What else we saw did well were those interviews I just had mentioned, featuring folks doing the work. So for example, you'll see this man on the right. His name is Ben Broadway, and he shared how infrastructure neglect in his community happens often, as evidenced with the flood inequities that people experience in certain neighborhoods. He was very relatable and human, and that stuck with people, right? Fun fact, he is amazing. He organizes the blind community in his neighborhood to heckle local government to make sure that they make good on, addressing water infrastructure gaps, which is really powerful. Something else we experimented with this campaign was starting to test content on Reddit. So after we released the animated video, we wanted to see what the reactions would be in different spaces and communities. And what we learned is it ended up being a channel that had high reach and deep engagement. So if you're unfamiliar with Reddit, there's a lot of nerds. There's people who flock to very niche communities for very focused conversations. So what we ended up doing was sharing the animated video in different subreddits, ranging from naming, there's one called Infrastructureist, infrastructure porn, urban tactical urbanism, solar punk. And we also dropped it in a civil engineering subreddit, and we learned a lot, including, some heat from the haters that I'll share later, that, some folks were really engaged and some were a little skeptical of the video's message. And generally, what we took away just on digital and for the campaign was that we would definitely recommend and found value in baking in artwork into campaigns, involving artists from the beginning as trusted advisors, instead of tacking them on at the end to, see them as a producer to just hook something in once it's fully baked, so that we can reach people's hearts better. We would also recommend and do more influencer collaborations when we have the resources to do so. And of course, whenever possible, spotlighting community voices to help create narrative change. And next, we'll share some feedback we got on the campaign online, including from the haters I mentioned, which is interesting. So first, this is someone who we've, through our digital listening, we saw on Facebook, who shared how the value this campaign had for Native communities and their water management. This person wasn't in our direct network, nor in a digital channel we're active in, so it was helpful to see that the campaign did have some reach and ripple effect to different spaces and people. As far as the civil engineer grumblings, they got a little spicy. They didn't take kindly to this hopeful message and the decentralized projects that we were, elevating in the video. And what this taught us is, probably no surprise to a lot of folks working in water, but there's still some work that needs to be done to get, the folks who are sometimes, designing these projects to get on board for these community-led solutions and nature-based solutions that we're really hoping to prioritize in communities that need it most. So it's definitely has a little bit of an old school energy and some, different perceptions that we need to shift. And we also got some love from our community, which was helpful. This is from someone at Bayou City Waterkeeper, and who shared that the flood justice materials were helpful for them in their wetland research. Next, let's talk about our influencer campaign. This came toward the end of the campaign with another funder support. And what we did is we engaged 8 different social media creators to talk about how these investments are increasing water and sanitation access, and to also speak to historic structural racism as it relates to water. So before I dive into our results, I just wanted to share a little bit more context on why the creator collabs work and why we're focusing on these more. As many of us know, the state of play is challenging for folks who are working in comms and for the public to learn about our important issues. We're seeing about 75% of the country's rigorous journalism behind a paywall, and over half of US counties having little to no access to local news now. So we have an opportunity though, because the majority of people in the US are getting their news from social media, and about 1 in 5 people are saying that they regularly get news from influencers, with folks of color, lower income people, and youth doing this at a higher rate, according to some new research. So this is a justice issue to reach folks who are often underserved, and why we need to be intentionally cultivating influencer relationships as part of our movement work. The opposition recognizes this and is very focused on investing in influencers long-term to mainstream their messages, and we need to do this as well, to meet folks where they're at through trusted messengers outside of the traditional media ecosystem. So we ended up working with folks across different geographies and backgrounds and niches, from a mental health advocate to a water protector, a community organizer in Texas, to an urban history buff in New York and beyond. These influencer partnerships generated high engagement and views and helped to humanize and diversify the messengers to spread awareness for this important issue. And across social, the video saw over 230,000 views, 26,000 replays, which is pretty important to think about because folks are just scrolling through their feeds. So if there were 26,000 replays, it means people were invested enough to go back and watch a piece of content again. And we saw 25,000 engagements, reaching new audiences to invite people to learn more. So next, I'm just going to introduce a couple of the influencers that we worked with. This is Keewaydin. They are a water protector from northern Minnesota who we've had the opportunity to work with before. They contextualize this issue by sharing a story about how a nearby tribal school had high levels of PFAS detected. And the comment section showed us that people are concerned about how Native communities are impacted by water issues and a lot of strong support for Keewaydin. Highly recommend, just as an aside, as if and when you do work with creators, it's really potent when you can continue to work with folks and develop those relationships because the stories tend to get more and more rich as you partner with them more. Next is Alexia Leclerc. She talked about specifically how water issues are affecting the Texas colonias and how she actually was applying for some funding from these laws. There was strong local support in the comments, and another Texas influencer actually offered to help with the grant writing, as you'll see here in one of the screen caps. We also worked with someone named Parker McCullen, aka Queenberg, another person that we've worked with in the past who's really fantastic. She reflected on the Denver context as well, and how clean water is really essential and how the community is impacted by lead pipe exposure, like lead pipe, replacement that is really important and needed to be accelerated in its removal. And folks in the comment section were talking about where they could see the resources that she shared. She was really great and shared a map of where all the lead pipes were in Denver in her video. We also worked with a young person named Mary Copney. She was 16 when we worked together on this video, and she spoke to kind of the broader picture of water access and the water crisis in the US. We saw folks with larger followings as well commenting on her content, and folks are highly engaged with Mari's videos. And even, months later, we were still seeing people engaging with the video and following us from it, which is unusual as, digital can be a fast moving beast. So it was a really popular piece that we collaborated on. And lastly, I just wanted to share Ariel Vieira, otherwise known as Urbanist Live. His focus is urban history. That's his lane. And he was really excited and passionate about this collaboration. And what he did is he focused on different communities across the US for a little bit of a longer piece, including the experience of folks who are out of Mount Vernon, New York, or Flint, or Jackson. And then he kind of used that constellation of case studies to circle back into how these laws can help improve conditions across the US if we continue to build support for this funding. Now, there was a little bit of sensitivity in the comments. Again, there is work to be done where someone was skeptical, asking, what does this have to do with race? So I don't want to paint this as being peaches and cream all the time. There's definitely lessons to be learned whenever you create content. You're not always going to get love, and all of it is great information for the future. And I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Jessica. It was a lot of fun seeing the influencer videos go out into the wild when it was happening earlier this year. I had the fun job of trying to generate media attention, traditional media attention on these issues. And so I want to share a little bit about our results, how we approach that, and lessons learned. And I've been doing public relations oriented work for a long time. and environmental communications for a long time. And I got to tell you, it's really challenging. We identified at the outset of the campaign that one of the things that we noticed through our research and observations is that most of the news coverage around these investments in water infrastructure in the last year or two have really been focused on the initial announcements of funding as they get like put out into the world. So, you know, at the time, Biden-Harris administration making these announcements, holding events, local coverage of project awards, members of Congress hosting events, that kind of thing. And so that was something that we wanted to try to move some additional solutions-oriented coverage to go deeper. So folks aren't just seeing dollar signs, but they're seeing what the real benefits are and the choices in how we actually invest this funding. And I have to say, it really felt like we were swimming upstream. It was really challenging. And we'll get into some of the reasons why and what we kind of did to combat that. But anyway, if you felt like you're having trouble getting a lot of attention on some of this stuff, we were too. So we're all in the same boat. Some of that I think has to just do with capacity. As we all know, journalists are stretched thinner and thinner these days. There aren't that many folks who are really focused on water issues as their beat. That kind of focus is like pretty few and far between. And you need to think of new ways to make these kinds of stories interesting and new and innovative to generate interest. So I want to share some of the results of what we did to combat that. So we worked with partners to push op-eds in their local papers touting how we can use this moment to bring multiple benefits into our communities. So this is an example of an op-ed we worked on with our friends at Milwaukee Water Commons and the Blue Green Alliance in Milwaukee, talking about the opportunity to invest in local job creation with lead pipe replacement efforts. We also used a technique that we have implemented over the last several years to sometimes great effect, and is doing less timely, more background-oriented media briefings. So for each of the content pillars and then a couple extra opportunities that we had identified at the beginning of the campaign, so looking at flood justice, lead and copper and PFAS issues, looking at regional ways to kind of organize these stories, we held a series of media briefings for reporters. So these were virtual webinars that were intended for an audience of journalists primarily. They were on the record, and they weren't focused on any particular timely event, but were meant to provide opportunities for journalists to get more background information on what's happening with particular issues that touch these water infrastructure investments. And also introduce them to new experts and community organizations that they may not have known. So one of those that we did was focused on nature-based investments and irrigation improvements in the Upper Colorado River Basin, which resulted in this story in Deseret News, which is a Utah-based newspaper. We worked on some other commentary around this idea of unbuilding, which is focused on really working with nature for flood, dealing with flood issues, and not just these kind of like heavy control flood mitigation solutions. And we worked on a couple of briefings in the Great Lakes region focused on the problems and also the solutions that communities in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio primarily were focused on. So as I mentioned, we came across some of these challenges. Again, our goal was to get past this kind of overwhelming initial interest on funding and really look at projects in the long term and their community benefits and hearing from people on the ground. And that was really hard. These projects often take a really long time to see those benefits. It's not always the most visual thing. If like you've got a splash day funding announcement, but then you've got a whole bunch of work and often years between when that's made and when a project is completed. There is still a lot of focus on water infrastructure as pipes and treatment plants, when we also want to see things like floodplains and forests as part of our broader water infrastructure conversation. And there was a real healthy tension between conflict really drives news. And so I think there was some really healthy accountability reporting about where these funds are going, where they're being used. And we wanted to also work with our partners who really wanted to push that accountability message in terms of the targeted investments that were needed in communities that have historically not been able to access this kind of funding, with this message of how we can kind of like win the win on the benefits of water investments. So we felt that sort of healthy tension as well. Some takeaways that I'll have from this is you need more than a good story, which is something I feel like a lesson I have to learn over and over again doing this kind of work. You need more than just really compelling characters. You need good visuals. You need a timely hook to kind of get that first lead paragraph in a news story of why something matters, why it's worth writing about right now. So I think that's something worth thinking through if you're trying to get attention on a project or an issue that you're working on. We also found that the more hyper local and specific that we could get, the more successful that we were in generating media coverage. So having folks take part in our briefings who were really close to the projects, so managing the projects themselves, implementing them, seeing the results in real time, and being able to report back on both the challenges but also the benefits that they were seeing right away, was the most successful. But that also took a lot of time and led to more local coverage than national media coverage. And so that was something that I think is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that we noticed and tried to lean into a little bit more as the campaign went on. And those things take a lot of time and energy to put together, and the footprint is a little bit smaller. But I think is like a really helpful takeaway for us as we look towards what we want to do next. And I think actually I start this next part, so I'll keep talking. I see a lot of great stuff happening in the chat, so I think we'll be able to end and have a decent 10-15 minutes to do some Q&A and discussion as well, and can hopefully answer some of those questions via voice too. So what do we do now? How do we take these learnings and pivot into 2025 and beyond? So one thing that we think is really important as communicators and folks who think about and put into practice is that our communications should be values-led. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. It didn't change in 2016. It's not going to change today. Folks have been working on these issues in urban and rural areas all across the country for years and years and years. And this is one of these like tried and true principles that we just want to carry forward. We might shift a little bit in our messaging strategy or the places that we focus, but ceding narrative ground is not something that we need to do. We know in our hearts that making our communities thriving and more livable is good for everybody, and we can do that no matter what. We also saw that when folks had water investments on the ballot as ballot measures, whether it was at the county level or the state level, in a number of states across the US, this is true in Minnesota, Colorado, New York, California, voters support efforts to invest in our water infrastructure and to improve the quality and safety and access to water in their communities. So that's something I think we can lean on as, whether or not like the word climate change becomes politically toxic or not. Investing in water, future-proofing our communities, these are all values that we can continue to lean into. And then the last thing, which we've seen in our research, our polling over the years, other kinds of research, was reiterated on a recent American Rivers webinar that I attended 2 ago, is that drinking water is something that voters care very deeply about. And the more we can connect issues to how they help us improve and protect the safety and access and affordability of our drinking water, the better off we are. It just really connects to people's hearts and homes in a way, and is just generates the most amount of support or concern that we see. So I guess that's our hot tip coming into this.
So to round us out, I just wanted to share a couple more things, is that, as the federal level is a little bit of a lion's den at the moment, what we need to do long term is to keep telling local stories of progress to build that YIMBY support and beneficial FOMO. We want people in red states, blue states, everywhere to see the potential of this type of work and how it can benefit nature and their communities, so that we can keep getting support for investments like this in the future. We also need to diversify our communication strategies beyond traditional media, as I mentioned, and just making it clear about how people can get involved or the actions they can take to actualize our vision on having access to clean water and thriving communities. With that, I will stop talking and we can open this up to Q&A. I'm going to drop a survey link in the chat and make an unapologetic plug to please fill it out while you're here and it's fresh in your mind, and you can listen in. But I did want to share something about the first question that I saw come in the Q&A, and it was relating to digital. So here we go. I see another question here about Twitter engagement, but first I'm going to answer Sylvia's question. She asked, what were the platforms for the influencers, and was the content created to meet those metrics? So the primary platforms with the influencers that we worked with was geared toward Instagram Reels and TikTok. Some of them chose to cross-post other channels, like Ariel, Urbanist Live, also cross-posted to Facebook and LinkedIn since he had a presence there, but it was intended to be short-form video for especially on Instagram and TikTok. And so our primary metrics for that work was message saturation and awareness, so that's like views, and also engagements. So it ended up being really popular, with some of them performing better than others. I hope that answers your question, Sylvia. There's great questions in the chat. How did we determine which influencers to work with, since this is related to the first question, Rachel? So I could go on about this forever, but essentially for this context, we wanted to diversify the geography to make sure it's representational of different areas across the US and their unique water challenges. But we wanted to get outside of the echo chamber of the climate and environmental echo chamber. So that's why we worked with an urban history buff. We also worked with somebody who's a mental health advocate to kind of mix up the messenger and who we're speaking to. And of course, we did a lot of vetting to make sure that they were values aligned and a good fit. This part of the work is very time intensive, but yes, it is really a fun process and a time intensive process to select the right influencers when you're working on a campaign.
One from the chat from Amy is thinking about when or not to move beyond traditional media. So the question is, if an org is planning to be more intentional about earned media, would you say yes, keep working on that, or leave it and focus on some of these other avenues? That's a really good question, and I'm gonna try to not just do the like it depends answer, which is my inclination. But I think one thing that's really important to think about in doing any kind of really intentional communication strategy is who you're trying to reach, because your audience will generally guide you in the direction of where to focus. One of the reasons why we still wanted to have an earned media component is because like, hey, if you're trying to reach people in your community and you know that there's, the one or two news programs that most people are watching and the newspaper that people are reading, those are still really good places to go. They're external validators for your organization and your message. But we also know that that's something that decision makers in particular really care about. And so we wanted to continue to kind of bolster the support for continuing these kinds of investments. And so to do that, we wanted to have an earned media component of the campaign. And so I think that's something to think through. And these things they're not operating in a vacuum. So we took media hits and turned them into pieces of content, videos and social media content, and vice versa. We used other pieces of creative content in our media strategy. So these things are connected and used as ways to kind of like raise awareness in one another. But I think it really depends on who you're trying to reach. If you know you're trying to reach a particular audience that cares a lot about certain like influencers, or we've done a lot of research to kind of identify who the people we wanted to work with were based on the community online we were trying to reach. So it does take a little bit of time, but that hopefully helps answer the question a little bit, and just thinking through like, who am I really trying to reach, and like what's the point? And I think there are a lot of external pressures that come from within our organizations, from funders, from decision makers, and things that can all influence that for sure. I was also seeing a question here: how might the campaign tactics change in 2025 given the incoming administration and political climate, to ensure this work continues, especially at the federal level? I think for us, and I would really love to hear what Jessica thinks as well, but when we're I think what we're hearing from partners is that there needs to be an effort to kind of really hone in on a focus, like what really are the big priorities people are going to be pushing for, defensive or offensively, when it comes to federal policy, the things that are really at risk that we care about, or probably some very limited opportunities to push for things. But for us, we see this as a really important time where narrative work is more important than ever. And that's what we're kind of talking about, like seeding that narrative ground. So continuing to advance a vision for the world that we're trying to build. Not to say that needs to be like naive or like untethered from the reality that we're living in, but it is really important for folks to like get behind something like that, so that when there is an opportunity to potentially advance stuff, we're not like starting from scratch all over again. So I would say, like, in terms of the tax, the tax, it just depends on like the particular issue or campaign, but I think it's just like we see like this discipline and just continuing to kind of hammer on these like proactive values-based issues. And values-based doesn't always mean positive. It can mean fighting against stuff as well. That will help us continue to build kind of power on the ground, so that we can change the political winds. And then also when those opportunities arise, we're like game to jump on them a little bit. So I guess that's how I'd answer that. I'm curious what you think, Jessica.
Similarly, just on digital, being persistent with your messaging, like you were saying, Sarah, repeating our values again and again. We shouldn't be, kind of retreating from this, and, taking a page, unfortunately, from the opposition is like, you keep beating the drum, you keep saying the same thing, make your your message is really simple so that, you know, you can persuade people, say next time there is visibility around a federal issue for what we're working for, people are accustomed to seeing that content in front of them. It's not something that's a flash in the pan and then it's gone. So it's really important now to continue to build that bedrock of messaging out there. Something just anecdotally there, just, you know, not, it's reflective of digital in general. And I think something that the left needs to work on is not seeing things as like a campaign moment where you're really focused about talking about something. And then like, once it's over, you kind of stop talking about it. So it's not a time to back off what we're fighting for. So, I mean, Sarah, you covered it very well, but that's what I would say on the digital front as in addition. I was just looking for some data because someone asked if we saw activity on Twitter. So I'm looking over here, but listening.
Great. We probably won't get to everything, so just to reiterate, I put in the chat, but we will be sending out an email recap with this recording and links. Feel free to respond to that. That'll or you can always reach out to us at info@waterhub.org. And we're happy to chat if there's things we didn't get to. I did really like this question. Is there anything in the campaign that didn't work and you had to abandon? I think that we did end up investing more time and energy into the digital side of the campaign than the earned media side. And I think that was partly by design and partly because it just seemed to be working better. So I will say that throughout these kinds of campaigns, it's important to like be flexible and doubling down on the things that seem to be more engaging. I think the other thing we noticed was the content that was really people forward performed the best. So hearing firsthand from folks on the ground and the issues that they're experiencing and what they want to see in their communities performed better. And the artwork on digital performed better than the case studies. That's something I think Jessica mentioned in her digital readout, but that was something that we definitely noticed, and so decided to kind of more double down on that. I don't know if there was anything in particular that we abandoned, but if I think of it, we'll include in the follow-up. And then Rebecca asked, can you share a little bit about the messages grounded in hope? Curious to hear and see how the emotional appeal moved people. Can I kick that to you, Jessica, to start us off?
Yeah, so I was just pulling up Twitter. Just briefly on Twitter, just wanted to circle back to that. We did see activity on Twitter. As far as engagements, we saw compared to other platforms, it had a lower level of engagement compared to other channels. So I think that's indicative of just the state of play on Twitter as people are moving to different platforms. So just wanted to recognize and name. Yes, we saw activity on Twitter. It was at a lower, rate of return on engagement. As far as hopeful messaging, a lot of our social media copy had a focus on benefits, right? And just the holistic nature of what we could actualize together if these buckets of funding were implemented equitably. So when we were sharing content that talked about, from forest to faucet, approaching this as seeing nature and community as, needing to be seen in holistically, folks did resonate with that content. We also shared, copy that really focused on stories of progress. And when we focused on the well-being of families and neighborhoods. So we saw that there was, positive reception to that content in comments. And so instead of just focusing on the doom and gloom of this is the gap, this is why it's so dire. And it was the intention of the campaign just in general was just stories of progress and solutions while not being tone deaf or Pollyanna-ish either. Let's see here. I'm looking through the comments.
I like this question. I know we're over. We're happy to keep going. Folks jump off. Thank you so much for being here with us. We'll keep talking a little bit while longer. A question from Betsy on addressing this question of like, are public officials and utilities in the messaging and communication? So this is something that's really hard, to trying to narrow down who you're trying to reach and which communications tactics are meant for each audience. So we did have a couple of different audiences that we used in this campaign, and what we heard from partners was that they wanted to reach both their local community members and their decision makers. And so we our different communications tactics and materials were focused on different audiences. So for example, the fact sheets that we created were really geared towards those public official audience members. Whereas our digital campaign was really focused on stuff that our community members could share and reach their digital audience for and engage with people in their community. And our earned media strategy was a little bit more focused on that kind of public official utility side of things. We sort of segmented and used different strategies to reach those different audiences. Now they're all part of this kind of cohesive campaign. So in theory, they should all look like they look the same and they use a lot of the same messaging and artwork and all that. But there were slight differences in the way that we went about each of those things. And then maybe this will be our last question about organic and digital and paid online. So Jessica, maybe you can answer that one. We used any paid ads for our digital strategy, or if we were organic focused.
It was primarily organic, outside of the influencer collabs. However, we did do a push on YouTube actually, and that was to help promote the animated video with shortened clips to try to drive views on YouTube, and just seeing what clips from the video itself resonated most from, with audiences. If folks are interested, I'm happy to share the results in the email follow-up, and we can drop that report as well.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks everyone for being with us here today, and please fill out the survey so we can know what's helpful, what we should do in the future, all that good stuff. And just appreciate all of the time and energy, and hopefully we'll keep using these things in the new year, but also excited about whatever the next big campaign we work on will be. So if you have ideas or things you need and want, we're always open, and look forward to working with you all in 2025.